Why Pearl Harbor became a day of shame for the United States. Unknown facts. December 7th, 1941. This day seemed no different from any other typical morning in Hawaii. The warm rays of the sun pierced through the clouds, and the air was filled with the scent of salt and ocean freshness. However, for those who were at Pearl Harbor that day, it would forever remain the day when the world changed. The U.S. Pacific Naval Base in Hawaii, Pearl Harbor. This was the place where the American fleet held its power, considering itself safe. But on that day in early December, nothing foreshadowed disaster. Why? Why did this happen? And what unfolded when the world was on the brink of a new world war? 7:55 a.m. Without any warning, the Empire of Japan delivers a devastating blow. Planes, like clouds, block out the sun. More than 350 Japanese aircraft fill the sky, and they carry no peaceful intentions or offers of peace. This attack strikes at the very heart of American power. Japan, seeking to establish dominance in the Pacific, decided to strike first. When the Americans at Pearl Harbor began to realize what was happening, it was already too late. Without any declaration of war, at a moment when the world expected peaceful negotiations, they were shattered by the brutal bombs falling from Japanese planes. The first strike was aimed directly at the ships in the harbor, while Japanese bombers began dropping their deadly gifts on American military airfields. But the Japanese didn't stop there. In just a few minutes, they destroyed nearly all of the aviation that was on the ground. American pilots didn't even have time to take off. This wasn't just an attack, it was a shock, a betrayal, delivered at the most unexpected moment. Numerous ships, including the flagship USS Arizona, were destroyed. Many sank, and others were severely damaged. The roar of explosions, the blare of sirens, and the cries of those trying to survive, all of this happened simultaneously. The explosions were not only destroying ships, but also the very peaceful existence of the United States. The thought that the strike came from the other side of the ocean seemed unimaginable, but nonetheless, it happened. The most brutal attack on American soil in history began at a time when even intelligence hadn't managed to warn the country. No one knew that an enemy could come to Pearl Harbor with such force. The quality of the attack was blinding. The Japanese planes performed all maneuvers to cause as much destruction as possible. They bombed ammunition depots, oil tanks, torpedo boats, and heavy warships. Each hit was not just destruction of infrastructure, it was the loss of thousands of lives. More than 2,000 people died that day. Those who survived became witnesses to what could never be forgotten. It was a horror no one had expected. A few hours after everything had quieted down, there was an eerie sense of dread in the air, and on the ground, not a single ship was left standing in its place. Buildings were destroyed, airfields turned to dust. Even if the Americans had managed to get their planes in the air, they had already lost most of them in the first minutes of the attack. In less than 2 hours, Pearl Harbor had turned into hell, and America became the victim of the most powerful attack it had ever experienced. Now, as the dust began to settle, one question echoed in the minds of all the survivors. What happens next? A question that at that moment had no answer. The answer was simple but terrifying. War. A war the United States was not prepared for, but one it had to become a decisive player in. But what if the attack on Pearl Harbor hadn't happened? What if U.S. intelligence had managed to prevent this attack? And how would the course of the war have been changed? By the time Pearl Harbor had completely lost its strategic value, America realized the inertia that had led the country into peacetime could not continue. The attack was a signal that the world would never be the same, and the consequences of this act of aggression would be so destructive that no event that followed could be ignored. As the smoke from the explosion slowly began to clear, one question pierced every American's mind. What now? What might have happened if the attack had been prevented, or if intelligence had discovered the enemy's preparations a few hours earlier? But as the sky cleared from the ashes, one thing became clear. War was now inevitable. Japan had struck, and now the U.S. had to respond. And respond not just as a nation, but as a power ready to resume the fight for survival. But was there a chance to avoid this? About 24 hours after the attack, on December 8, 1941, U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt gave his famous speech before Congress, declaring that December 7, 1941 would be a day of infamy that would remain in the nation's memory. Just hours later that same evening, the U.S. officially declared war on Japan. Nations that were not prepared for full full-scale conflict now found themselves plunged into one of the bloodiest and most destructive wars in human history. This day marked the beginning of a new phase of World War II. It became the start of what would later turn into a global battle between the Allied powers and the Axis. It was also the moment when the Pacific Ocean became a battleground of bloody combat and America entered a war that was already at its doorstep. The second front was opened, but it wasn't just a strategic decision, it was a challenge. And while Pearl Harbor was a brutal attack, the consequences were even worse. This day became a defining moment in world politics and in the battle that lay ahead. When Pearl Harbor burned, every American knew this was not just a defeat, it was the beginning of something much larger, and the war, which was now inevitable, promised to be like nothing the world had ever seen. If that day marked the beginning of the war for the U.S., it also marked the culmination of the confrontation between the forces clashing in this war. From that moment on, Pearl Harbor was not just a strategic loss, but a symbol that would carry its powerful weight in the minds of generations. The tragedy of that day became a cornerstone of the entire conflict. For now, the war was personal for everyone, touching every family, every individual. Americans realized that to win, they would have to endure the hardest trial, but also understand that war has no boundary, and it doesn't stop until the enemy is defeated. The process of recovery was long, but it was only the beginning. As tragic as it was, Pearl Harbor opened new pages in history that the country striving for victory would have to write. But it was then, at that moment, that Americans understood the war was just beginning.